Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back and relax while the maestro conducts our closing symphony. Mr. Robert Vijay Gupta.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real distinct privilege to be here, and I'm so grateful to Patrice for such a warm welcome, and it's really such a delight to be here. One of the most memorable experiences I had playing that very same piece by Johann Sebastian Bach was for a very, very different audience. I drove out to the Patton State Mental Hospital in San Bernardino, about 80 miles east of Los Angeles, and I performed the chaconne and two other small pieces for two groups of inmates. And everyone who's incarcerated at Patton is there because they've committed a crime, sometimes a violent crime, due to a severe mental illness. And so I performed at one compound, and we're on our way to the second one, and I'm warned, sort of gently by the coordinators, that this is a compound for the more acutely mentally ill individuals. Many of them will be visibly disturbed. The coordinators didn't actually think it would be a very good idea to have the concert, but I said, I'm here, I've got my fiddle, let's go. And I drove a long way. So I started playing, and we're sort of in this room, and it's a lower stage, and there's a little crucifix hanging, and I'm in a room with about 30, 40 individuals. And except for a few people that got up and left during the concert, I've never connected so deeply with an audience. I've never felt the room held in such a space of openness, of mutual vulnerability from the performer's side, but also from the audience side. And I saw tears, I saw smiles. And afterward, I was greeted with this amazing reception, the kind of reception that I would expect to receive backstage at Disney Hall. You know, this line of smiling, broad-shouldered, confident people in brown jumpsuits. And they're in this line, and they grabbed my hand, and they thanked me for coming, and they welcomed me back as if to their home. And I got an email from the coordinators a couple of days later who were just completely shell-shocked by this. They had never before seen their patients sit together in a room quietly, much less calmly, listening to a performance of classical music. They had never seen their patients so enthusiastic before, never seen them, they hadn't stopped talking about the concert 2 days later. And many of them didn't need as many sedatives before they went to sleep at night. And they said also that the few individuals who did leave, they left because they were sobbing. And so many of us hide from our most powerful emotions. But my friends at Patton never learned how to get a handle on those emotions, but possibly more importantly, never learned a creative outlet for those emotions. And very often it was those emotions themselves that landed them at Patton in the first place. There was a woman at the back of the line. Her name was Susanna, and she came up and she shook my hand, and her story was corroborated by the psychiatrist at Patton as well, that she had trained as a concert pianist in Armenia and had come to the States, started her career, and ended up somehow at Patton. And I wondered if her story was anything like the story of my friend Nathaniel Ayers, whose story has now become such a beacon for homelessness and mental health advocacy throughout the US. And I wondered how many more Nathaniels were out there. How many more Nathaniels are homeless on Skid Row? How many more Susannas are in places like Patton? And she said to me the most beautiful thing. She said, you know, Bach is my universe, and Beethoven is the soul of the world. And this clicked in my head a couple of months later, because I remember reading as a little kid that in 1977 we sent remember the Voyager spacecraft we sent out into space and then beyond our solar system? And on Voyager we put this golden disc that had all of the greetings of Earth's languages and also some of the greatest artistic accomplishments of humankind, namely the music of Bach and Beethoven, literally sent from the creative soul of the world into the universe. And when we think about Bach today, we see this foreboding marble bust, sitting on the shelf in the Musikverein in Vienna with this, curls like a judge, or we think about him sitting at the organ console with his back to us. And, Bach now occupies this pantheon of composers whose names start with B. Bach and Beethoven and Brahms and Bartók and Berg and Berlioz and Bieber. And I don't mean Justin Bieber. But when we look at Bach's life, we find this deeply humble man, a deeply devout man, who was constantly engaged in rediscovering himself, rediscovering what he could say through his medium. And when he wrote this chaconne, this dance for the solo violin, which was completely unprecedented, Bach was in such a phase of rediscovery. He had just left the employ of an abusive duke in Weimar who actually imprisoned him to prevent him from leaving. You think transition between jobs now is hard. You know, try on an asshole duke for size. You know. And so Bach went to this new town called Köthen and was working under a prince named Leopold, and he was immediately told when he joined that they didn't have an organ and he couldn't write for the voice because they didn't believe in sacred music in the church. And anyone who knows Bach's music thinks about that amazing toccata for organ, da-da-dum, be-da-da-dum. So no organ music, and no vocal music. And so what did Bach start writing? He started writing orchestral music, instrumental music. And we have the Brandenburg concertos, we have the orchestral suites, and of course, most importantly, we have the unaccompanied works for violin and for cello. But Bach took a trip during this time, and he came back, and he found that his wife had suddenly, tragically died. So here he was, in this new city, with 7 little mouths to feed, completely bereft of his companion, and having to reinvent himself every step of the way. And what did he do? He wrote the chaconne. And this piece was completely unprecedented for so many reasons that nobody imagined that a violin could not only hold 2 lines, but sometimes 3 and 4 lines independently in counterpoint on its own. That a piece of such scale and magnitude could be written for one instrument. People have often asked that maybe if Bach had a concert grand piano, he would have written the chaconne for the piano. And it's complete BS. Of course, because the whole point of the power of the chaconne is that it is for this tiny, intimate instrument. It's the power of one voice, right? It's the power that that one voice has to bring us from the very depth of despair, of Bach's grief, to jubilation and joy, where he weaves in tons of Lutheran hymn tunes into the fabric of the chaconne, this repeating bass line throughout the entire piece, and then brings us back into the sort of core of his grief and his rediscovery. And for me as a performer, playing this piece is like active psychotherapy, because I'm constantly finding new aspects of myself, not only as a performer just to juggle the technical difficulties of the chaconne, but also spiritually and psychologically, that the further I go into the human experience, the more of a glimpse I have to the character of this great master. And I bring up the theme of rediscovery because I feel that it's really been core to what we've been talking about here at this conference in the last couple of days. Just in the brief conversation I had with Patrice yesterday, we were talking about how the conversations have revolved around finding new ways to continue to fund the canon in the arts and find those amazing art projects, find the new generation. How do we fund the amazing Latino arts organizations and advocacy organizations that are popping up all over the country? And as custodians of the arts, as artists and funders of the arts, we are in the unique position. We have the unique responsibility of truly making the arts accessible and impactful. And it's a huge responsibility. And possibly it's never been more important. As a representative of the orchestral world, our world is falling apart. Just yesterday, the Seattle Symphony announced a strike. Atlanta Symphony just came out of a strike. Minnesota, St. Paul, those orchestras decimated. They're on lockout from their audiences and from their concert halls. Even orchestras like the amazing Philadelphia Orchestra, coming out of bankruptcy, now has to completely embrace the idea of outreach, which only existed on the fringes of the organization. It has to embrace outreach for the fiscal sustainability, the community sustainability of the organization. But at the same time, we have an amazing sort of mixed plethora of community arts organizations that revolve around orchestras. In Los Angeles, we have the Harmony Project, or the Youth Orchestra of LA, which gives instruments to kids in some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. Kids that would otherwise join gangs and have guns in their hand now have violins and cellos and double basses and violas and flutes. And they're making music together. And this is the core, this is the soul of what an orchestra is about. It's a community. And of course, this is the El Sistema model. The model that is so famous in Venezuela that I actually saw firsthand a couple of months ago when I was on tour with the Philharmonic in Caracas. And we have these sort of projects popping up all over the country. The Atlanta Music Project, Play on Philly. And so here we are at this sort of crossroads, but I feel that we have an impetus here. We have an opportunity here to take that incredible vault of inspiration that we've been sort of gifted, blessed with over the last couple of days, and bring it back home. And to sort of skip over that post-conference depression, and to get this thing directly into action, to get the wheels turning. What do we do? How do we move forward from here? And so I feel that the core is in rediscovery. And I want to tell you about something that I rediscovered in myself, that if you would have told me 2 years ago that I'd be speaking for you here today, that I'd be running a nonprofit, I would have asked you gently to seek the advice of your favorite mental health professional. Because I was able to, but through a degree of inspiration, layers and layers and layers of inspiration, I found new tools within myself that I didn't think I had. And I feel that this is sort of the key, that let our inspiration define our new tools and not the other way around. And so I'll sort of dive into my story. Patrice sort of mentioned a little bit of it, and sort of this pivot, this rediscovery of mine didn't happen on a concert stage. It happened here, on this street on Skid Row. And there's a beautiful, ironic story that this street in downtown Los Angeles is called San Julian Street. And it was named by the Spanish when they landed in LA, and it was named after the patron saint of wanderers, who they themselves had been wanderers coming across the entire continent and finally landing in LA. And now, by this sort of weird paradox, San Julian Street is the epicenter of the homeless capital of the United States. It's home to over 50,000 individuals on any given night, 2/3 of whom are severely disabled or mentally ill. A large percentage of them are veterans of American wars. And perhaps most tragically, the fastest growing populations on Skid Row are families with children, with kids, and female vets. And when I saw Skid Row for the first time, it was like something shattered inside me. Because I was very lucky to have studied music since I was 4 years old. I had to have two very devoted parents who, through their typically Indian, Bengali, dogged determination, through them I was able to study at the Juilliard School in Manhattan, to play my debut in Tel Aviv with the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Zubin Mehta. Dreams and layers of dreams, and I started a small solo career. And this is a dream for me, it was a dream for my parents, but it wasn't such a dream for my school district. Because when I returned from a tour in India, I was told that I wasn't going to be allowed to take end-of-year exams in 6th grade, so I was effectively being failed in 6th grade. And as supportive as my parents were of me making music, I was still growing up in an Indian household, so there was no way in hell that I was allowed to fail 6th grade. So my parents pulled me out, and there were just battles with the school district going back and forth, and eventually the only way out, the only way for me to keep making music and to get a real education was to start going to college. So I started going to college when I was 13. And I started a second undergraduate studying music at the Manhattan School of Music the next year, but I remember reading one of my first years in school, this book that has become so famous now by Tracy Kidder about Paul Farmer, called Mountains Beyond Mountains. And I remember falling in love with science, with neuroscience, but also with the idea of becoming a doctor like him, of truly helping people on the ground, a doctor that would go into places with AIDS patients suffering from multi-drug resistant tuberculosis or kids with spinal TB. I wanted to become that kind of doctor, that Red Cross, Doctor Without Borders kind of doctor. And so I pursued this all the way up to landing a research internship at the Harvard Medical School. And there I met a neuroscience, a researcher named Gottfried Schlauch, who himself had studied at the Vienna Conservatory, had worked in neuroscience, was an organist, but sort of made this choice between music and medicine, so I had to ask him what it was like for him. And throughout this entire time, my heart was crying out to play music. If science was the language of my brain, music was the language of something deeper. And so I decided to study music for 2 more years before being, the good Indian son and applying to medical school to become the next Dr. Gupta. And at the end, I honestly didn't know what I would be doing. I didn't know. I thought every concert in New Haven at Yale was going to be the last concert that I played as a violinist. And so I came out to Los Angeles, and as a sort of desperate last chance, I auditioned for the LA Philharmonic. And it was my first audition. I was 19, and I won the job. And it was a dream. It was a dream. And there's not much more of a Hollywood dream for a classical musician than to win a job in the LA Phil. And my dad moved out with me because I didn't have any credit and I couldn't drive a car. And so here we are, and we're in LA for a couple months. We're driving around, and I'm downtown, and I go a little bit further south, a little bit further east than I intend to. And I see this for the first time. And there was this kind of alarm bell that went off in my head. That yes, I had pursued music, yes, I had found my dream, but it was mine. I was doing it for me. And that if I really ever had the propensity to help people, what the hell was I doing on Bunker Hill? I needed to be down here. I didn't have to go to Haiti or Ethiopia or India. This is where we have need for basic hygiene. And then I met a musician a couple of months later, who profoundly helped me shape my identity as a musician. And Patrice already mentioned his name, Nathaniel Ayers, the subject of Steve Lopez's book, The Soloist. Such a famous story now, but I feel that I'm so blessed because I've become Nathaniel's friend, and I became his violin teacher. On the many experiences that we had together, I saw how music was able to bring Nathaniel back from his very darkest moments, from what seemed to me the very brink of a psychotic episode. It was very surreal to see this deeply gifted man have a complete manic episode while holding a violin in his hands. And so I knew that if I could play with him, that we'd establish a degree of connection where there was no other possible degree of connection that could exist between us. And so I felt eventually that it would just continue to be disingenuous if I made Nathaniel keep coming to me, walking up the hill. And so the next lesson we had was on the sidewalk in front of the Colburn School across the street from Disney Hall, and then further down the hill in the basement of the LA Times building. And then one day on my 22nd birthday, I was working with Nathaniel, teaching him in his courtyard at the LA Men's Project right here on Skid Row. And we're just 6 feet from one of the most devastating places in the US, separated by nothing but rusting metal bars and barbed wire. And here we are, playing Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, and it was like something clicked in my head. That yes, the concert hall was amazing, it was a temple, but the concert hall can so easily become an ivory tower. In our case, the stainless steel tower. But here, there was a deeper degree of connection because Nathaniel was showing me that there was a deeper meaning of music, that this music was really, really about communication. It was about the communication of a message that went deeper than words, that came from the core of my humanity and registered in the core of his psyche. That it was a language that spoke where words and medicine and society had failed. And Nathaniel showed me that music was the bridge. If I was truly passionate about helping people, I already had the instrument to do it. There's this gorgeous quote by the German Romantic composer Robert Schumann, who says, "To send light into the darkness of men's hearts, such is the duty of the artist." And so I realized that Nathaniel was going to be fine. Nathaniel had a book written about him. He had a movie made about him. He was guaranteed to no longer be homeless. One person, 50,000. If there was one more person out there like Nathaniel, I started having nightmares. And so I reached out to a number of organizations on Skid Row, organizations working with veterans with PTSD, and I had this experience at a vet center. I was playing for 9 Vietnam combat vets. And as we know, sometimes these are the most deeply guarded vets. These are the vets that came back with no welcome when they came back home. And the newer Iraq and Afghanistan vets don't want to identify themselves with the vets from Vietnam because of the immense trauma the psychological trauma, the physical trauma that was done to the Vietnam vets that they're still suffering from. And so somehow I was welcomed into their group therapy session, and I was just playing alone, and I started with playing this tune, Danny Boy, and immediately one of the vets started bawling in the corner. And he said that he shared a foxhole with a friend of his who didn't make it, who used to sing a hymn that had the same tune as Danny Boy, and that he hadn't thought about his buddy for so many years and couldn't hold him in his heart, but that the music finally allowed him to break down. And then even more amazingly, there was a man who between pieces sort of mumbled. It was the only thing he said the whole day, and he said, in the whole session, and he said, guys, I know he's fun to watch, but close your eyes and listen, and you'll enjoy so much more. And so then I'm playing, and I have my eyes closed, and I pick them open, and they all have their eyes closed, except for the therapist who's starting to choke back tears. And when I called her a week later, she said, that was the most amazing thing that gentleman said that, because he suffers from hypervigilance. And he's so deeply paranoid that he has trouble closing his eyes to go to sleep at night. And he's the one who told the rest of the room to close their eyes. And so from experiences like this, I started a project in Los Angeles called Street Symphony, which is an ensemble of musicians from the Philharmonic, students from USC and the Colburn School, some of my favorite musicians in Los Angeles. And we go into the darkest places. And we play music by Schumann, and Brahms, and Beethoven, and Bach, and Bartok, and Berg, and Berlioz, and Bieber. And what we find in these places is often that the musicians are somehow the conduit for delivering the tremendous beneficial powers of music on the brain to a community that would never have access to our concert hall, who would not have access to the divide that exists in our world. But deeper than that, music becomes a conduit for a more empathic connection, maybe even a conduit for a type of human service, that the walls come tumbling down when we are able to enter in with this music. As citizens, we so need to see places like Skid Row. We need to see the inside of prisons. We need to see the inside of the asylums. We need to know that these are people. They're not numbers, they're not data, they're people. And they can be reached and touched just like you and I can be reached and touched. And to bring music into these places, it reminds us of our common humanity. And for those who have forgotten what it's like to experience beauty, for those who live in the most dehumanizing conditions of mental illness within homelessness and incarceration, this music brings a kind of spark of hope, because it reminds them that they still have the capacity to experience something beautiful, and that even in some degree that we all hold that beauty, perhaps that divinity, within all of us. And the spark of that blossoms into hope. And that's the beginning of healing. There's a beautiful TED Talk recently given by Dr. Ellen Sachs, who is a chair at the School of Law and Psychiatry, the Gould School at USC. And in this amazing talk, she talks about the humanity and the richness and the individuality surrounding mental illness. And she talks very candidly about her own experience with chronic schizophrenia. She talks about the horrors of hospitalization, the dehumanizing experience of being slammed down on a cold metal bed and being tied there against her will, and having therapists and professors tell her, those people are mentally ill. They don't feel things the same way that we do. But then she talks about acceptance. And she talks about the power of great psychotherapy, of new pharma that's surrounding schizophrenia, but most importantly, an accepting workplace and a loving home environment. All of us are touched, either by ourselves or in our families, by mental illness. And I feel that, we are in a sort of crossroads to destroy the stigma and the suffering and the ignorance surrounding mental illness. And Dr. Sachs says how the de facto treatment of mental illness in the US is incarceration. And the largest psychiatric institution in the United States is the downtown LA Men's Central Jail. Just this past summer, Street Symphony performed 15 events at 5 different LA County prisons, and 9 of them at the Twin Towers facility, the LA County Jail. And you saw a few of those pictures. And often, the theme that emerges in the Q&A after our performances is the theme of empathic collaboration. The inmates are so curious to know about how we craft a program, what the dynamic is between performers. And, I mean, anyone that's collaborated knows this. You know, the musicians that show up for a Street Symphony rehearsal have already brought their tens of thousands of hours of practicing and their perspective and their imagination and their interpretation of how the piece should go. But before we make a single note of music together, that ego, that perspective has got to go out the window. Otherwise, we can't make music together. It doesn't work. We cannot continually rediscover what this music is about. We cannot approach this from a place of humility. But at the same time, if we hold on to our egos, if we hold on to that perspective, we also can't openly challenge each other. We can't start a conversation, even. We don't open the space to disagree with each other. And I feel that this is a metaphor for where we are, for this element of rediscovery, of what we do going from here. So what do we do? Let's open that vault of inspiration that we received here. Let's share that. Maybe those conversations are going to be uncomfortable. Maybe those conversations are going to come from a place of deep vulnerability. But we have to ask those questions. We have that responsibility. We have that opportunity to do that. I remember, I'm going to close with one more story. At one of our events, we were having the Q&A, and there was this gentleman all the way in the back of a room of like 250 inmates. And he was asking me about Bach's life, and he shouted out, "Would you play some more Bach?" And I couldn't believe it. And I'm like, no, it's got to be some. And I asked him, I shouted back, I said, "Did you say Bach or Tupac?" And like a third of this room did exactly what you did. They started laughing, they started applauding. They're like, "Oh, play Tupac. If you can play Tupac, play Tupac." But you know something? The larger percentage of that room, the other 2/3, I've never heard this in my life, shouting, "Bach, Bach, play Bach." So I'd love to close by playing some more Bach for you. Thank you.